First, let me start with a warning. This talk discusses a quite sensitive issue and contains some examples of harmful language. They have been vetted, but still could potentially act as a trigger, to some of us at least, so I would like to acknowledge it in advance. 46% of women and marginalized gender identities have faced some form of gender-based online abuse. This phenomenon has actually got worse during and after COVID-19 pandemic. Of these, 50% are either non-binary people or Black and minority ethnic women. In particular, online forms of gender-based abuse are quite different from physical gender-based violence, as they're on a much sharper rise and are mostly perpetrated by complete strangers to the victim or target. Okay, so all of this sounds quite alarming, but you know what? Someone like me, a white man in his late 30s, might think, this is a women's problem to solve, right? Besides, I'm not the one being the abusive here, especially online. Hashtag not all men. Well, it turns out that this isn't the case. In fact, as Jackson Katz put it very nicely about 10 years ago at a quite influential TED Talk, violence against women is a men's issue to solve. Why? Because too often we easily dismiss it and think it just doesn't apply directly to us and allow this toxic culture to perpetrate. Now, let me tell you briefly my personal awakening with respect to this matter. During COVID, I was attending, a compulsory course on unconscious bias. It was remote, and that kind of like lesson was directed to line managers and student supervisors, such as myself. And at some point, we were asked to watch a video and discuss it in small breakout rooms. The video which was completely enacted, by the way, it was showing a scene at a rather busy bar, I would say. Probably it was on a Saturday evening, and it zoomed in at a couple of tables. One of them had like a group of women, chatting, dancing, clearly enjoying themselves. And right next to it, there was another table with a group of men, basically doing the same, having fun. And then at some point, one of the guys, at one of the two tables, quite evidently catcalled at one of the girls on the other table. And the girls was kind of like, okay, just ignored it, dismissed it, that happens. And then that was repeated one more time, and that was also ignored, at which point the guy actually stood up and approached that girl. We can't really make out what exactly is happening, what they're saying, but clearly the young man is trying to engage with the girl in a quite inappropriate manner. And the girl seems distressed, but she's trying to handle the situation. There's no physical contact, just verbal exchanges. Now, the rest of the men just don't react. It's like, whatever. And the rest of the girls try to support the target of what is happening, of that abuse, right? And at this point, the video freezes, and we, the people that were watching that, are posed with a question. Imagine you're at the third table, not too far, right? And essentially you are what we call a bystander. What would you do? Now, let me explain a little bit about the breakout room, right? In that, we were two similarly aged, mid-30s male academics, and we also had a middle-aged female non-academic person over there. What did we have to say? Both of the guys, we agreed that we would either observe and do nothing or say nothing, right? Or we were expecting somebody else to intervene, or maybe approach a member of staff, the bouncer, something like that, and they should take care of it, right? Now, the female participant almost effortlessly said something entirely different. She said, you know what, I would definitely stand up, approach the table, and confront the young guy, at least to show some support to the girl. And you know why? Because I have a daughter, which is at a similar young adult age. And then it dawned on me. You know what? I have a 30-year-old daughter too. Back then she was just born, And at some point in her life, she could also be in the same position. And then I would certainly hope that there's going to be some bystanders that would behave more like my female colleague rather than the male colleagues, the guys, just like me. So this is personal realization number one. In a moment, we'll come to the next one. But before that, I need to talk a little bit more about the problem as we are currently dealing with it, or we understand it, let's say, in academia. Now, what we usually refer to as gender-based violence starts with the definition of sexism. Now, sexism is this ideology that tries to rationalize and justify patriarchal stereotypes. So you have sexism on one side, and you also have misogyny. So misogyny is kind of like the policing, like it's the enforcement of these sexist norms and assumptions. Now, the thing is like that gender-based violence has evolved into what we call a framework, and we don't just look at those two things, misogynism and sexism, we look at several factors. We get to see who the perpetrators are. We are really interested in the technologies, the technology platform that we used to do that form of gender-based violence abuse. So it could be social media like Facebook, Twitter, Reddit. Actually, Twitter is one of the worst. Or it could be comments on YouTube or news websites. We're also looking at the nature of the violence, whether it's sexual, psychological, or physical. We're interested also in the type of the violent act, and usually we represent it as something like this pyramid that you see in the slide. It could be something offensive, right? It stems straight from a patriarchal sexist stereotype, and quite often it intersects. It's not just on its own. It could intersect with other kind of like forms of prejudice. So it could be racism, disablism, ageism. They could intersect. But let's say that we start from that kind of like last bit, which is the more benign form of sexism. But you know what? We can go one step higher, and we will have some form of harassment, which is either implicit or explicit in text. And of course, it could go all the way up to physical assault and worse. So we're also interested in the harm faced by the victim or survivor, whether it's low or high, it varies. And we're also interested in the social and bodily characteristics of the victim. So whether the violence is against, a minor female, a black minor female, or an ethnic minority female, and so on. And finally, what I need you to remember is that gender-based violence is usually not an isolated event, right? It's not a thing where it happens once, then you try to recover from it, and then that's it. It's not going to happen anymore. Victimization is episodic. It's mixing different forms and can happen multiple times across lifespans. Now, modern online gender-based violence has become more complicated and more multifaceted, and it ranges from simple threatening text messages on smaller groups, such as WhatsApp groups. It could be public harassment on social media, such as Facebook, Reddit, and Twitter. As I said, Twitter is one of the worst. But the forms can go beyond text, right? It could be things like revenge pornography or deep fakes of colleagues or even schoolmates. And it can also be more systemic, abusive behavior, such as doxing, catfishing, and cyberstalking. Okay, time for my personal realization number 2. The reason I chose to give this talk to you guys is largely due to my involvement with a research project at my university that tries to tackle online gender-based violence using AI, and in particular, an area called natural language processing, or NLP. Now, you might not have heard of the term NLP before, that's okay, but I'm pretty sure you have all heard and used technologies in generative AI, such as ChatGPT, Bard, and so on. So all of these are applications of NLP. And by the way, this also happens to be my research area for the past 15 years. So when I first joined the project, coming from essentially a computer science background, I thought that, a clean-cut approach using NLP models was all that was needed. Because after all, if we just feed the computer enough data, then it can learn to predict and come to the perfect solution, right? Well, wrong again. You see, it turns out that as computer scientists, we could easily end up focusing on a rather arbitrary view of the problem. And that's not on purpose, by the way, right? But that view doesn't necessarily coincide with the lived experiences of a victim of gender-based violence, or in my case, the lack of such experiences. And that's because of the rest of the characteristics that I described myself with. Remember, I'm white, male, in my 30s, late 30s. So adding to that, to that list, a relatively high educational level in computer science doesn't make me an expert in gender-based violence. In other words, I don't have the lived experience to be such an expert, especially with other genders. And because I don't, my solutions could fail to address a problem that I just can't perceive. Okay, so you might think that, well, you know what? Does that mean that NLP or AI or you cannot do something about that? Well, no, okay. The solution is quite simple. We try to partner with the right cohort of experts. In this case, it's other academics in psychology and social sciences, and also experts that work in charities that support victims of gender-based violence. What do we gain? We gain two things. And since this is a TEDx event with primarily a younger audience, as you guys, let me share a single piece of advice. Never stop learning. I certainly didn't, to the point where actually even my research views got transformed and augmented by this new field that was posed to me. And the second thing is that only experts with lived experiences can truly align the output of a model to the objectives that we want to achieve, to detect and mitigate online gender-based violence. Now, let's look at the first way that we can use NLP to tackle online gender-based violence, which is to detect instances of it. Okay, so using data from various sources that might contain abusive content, such as tweets, for example, we then take the opinion of people, or even better, the opinion of experts in gender-based violence, remember, and we take that opinion in the form of just a label. They tell us it's sexist or not sexist. And then we train a machine learning model to classify it automatically. Okay, jargon there, don't worry. Training a machine learning model is a lot like teaching a computer how to do something. That's it. And the model is designed to find patterns in lots of data we provide as input and use these to make predictions, in this case, to choose the correct class. Given a tweet, it's sexist or not sexist. Now, an immediate application of that could be to automatically, moderate the content. No human intervention. Another thing that you could do is basically point out potential harmful tweets to a human moderator, and then they can get to decide. So it could be an assistive tool. However, we can even go beyond this kind of like sexist, not sexist binary classification, right? We can try to provide an explanation with further evidence on the nature of the gender-based violence. Remember the pyramid? Like the nature of that, the severity, and so on and so forth. Now, going back to this notion that it's not a simple computer science problem, we also have to take into account that the labels provided are essentially different opinions formed by attitudes and beliefs. In other words, not all people will have exactly the same opinion on whether a particular tweet contains a form of gender-based violence, and this can depend on several factors, such as their socioeconomic status, their education level, their political beliefs, their views on conservatism, morality, you name it, or their own lived experiences. Opinions of the people most affected are essential to create more holistic solutions. Okay, so detecting gender-based violence is definitely a very useful thing. And I would say it's the first step to creating a safer online environment. However, removing content through moderation can only hide, I would say, the problem. It doesn't necessarily address it. Okay? So even the extra evidence provided is passive and could just, be ignored, dismissed, whatever. It says it's sexist, not sexist. What can I do? Well, what we can do is to try to give a voice to the target of abuse or even to the bystanders. How? Well, we can go one step further and try to provide direct responses to such comments by trying to challenge perpetrators and in that way showing support and empowering the targets of the gender-based violence. But not only that, counter speech, which is what we call this type of statements that you can see examples of, can also be directed to bystanders. So these bystanders could be either belong in an inner group the same as the targets of abuse, so other people that are on Twitter that could have been also victims of gender-based violence, they could be addressed to an inner group similar to the perpetrator as well. So other people reading this tweet feed that are also male and probably sympathetic to the views of the perpetrator, but they're just not saying anything. And of course, they could also be directed to another outer group, such as myself, a male that is potentially sensitive to gender-based violence, but isn't, or hopefully by now wasn't, willing or brave enough to speak up. Now, although it's harder to achieve and measure the effect and impact, the ultimate goal, I would say, is to mitigate the behavior of the perpetrator to avoid repeating. So the use of generative AI models is a quite good choice, I would say, since they tend to generate really fluent output and it's quite controllable. Also, given enough supervision and moderation by experts, they can even serve a much better purpose than the more average vocal community of bystanders who could try to offer, similarly counter narratives, but accidentally could end up triggering the victim or misinforming the victim or the bystanders and so on. And you can see examples there of the strategies we can employ. We can provide some facts, we can try to be ironic or humorous or even having an overall positive tone towards the target of the gender-based violence. So, let me end this talk with a sober but positive note. Online gender-based violence is a real problem. It can be multifaceted. It is often more complex than what is considered gender-based violence in the non-digital world, and it certainly isn't a women's problem only. However, I believe we can make use of AI in ways that can help us address it, detect it, mitigate it, and hopefully create a safer online environment that will protect targets, empower victims, give a voice to bystanders to rise above circumstances and face the situation, and even have a positive impact on the behavior of the perpetrators. Thank you very much.